A prejudiced female police officer brazenly shone her flashlight into the face of a black man, forcing him out of his car, completely unaware that he was a Navy colonel. The moment his identity was revealed felt like a slap in the face to her deeply ingrained biases. Blatant injustice and racism were laid bare for all to see. Would justice prevail? Or would injustice triumph again? Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to witness more of these infuriating stories. David Johnson, an African-American U.S. Navy colonel, had just returned after an 8-month deployment at sea. The long months away from his family had been challenging, but today all his exhaustion seemed to fade as he imagined the moment he would reunite with his wife and 2 young children. He drove through familiar streets, the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting off his car windows, creating a warm, cozy atmosphere on this late autumn evening. David had meticulously planned a surprise for his family. He hadn't informed them of his return, hoping to see their sheer joy when he walked through the door. His heart raced with excitement, beating eagerly in anticipation. In just a few minutes, he would be wrapping his arms around his loved ones, soaking in the warmth he had longed for throughout those months away. But his dream was abruptly interrupted. Behind him, red and blue lights flashed, illuminating his rearview mirror. The wail of a siren startled him momentarily. David frowned, puzzled at what was happening. He hadn't been speeding, nor had he violated any traffic laws. So why was he being pulled over? He pulled his car to the side of the road, his heartbeat quickening. He had never been in a situation like this before, and a sense of unease began to rise within him as his car came to a stop. David glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a young female officer step out of the patrol car. The name tag on her chest read Officer Hayes. Her hand hovered near her sidearm, her gaze cold and suspicious. Confusion and apprehension enveloped David. He sat still, keeping both hands on the steering wheel, instinctively signaling he had no intention of doing anything unusual. The atmosphere grew heavy, and he thought to himself, what is about to happen? As the officer approached, her flashlight beamed directly into his face. Her voice was sharp, tinged with suspicion as she commanded, "Driver, step out of the vehicle immediately." David swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. But inside, a storm was brewing. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as Officer Hayes's flashlight shone directly into his face. He kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, as though affirming he had no intention of resisting. Yet the officer's suspicious gaze and alert posture made him feel increasingly uneasy. Officer Hayes stopped right beside the car door, her eyes scrutinizing every detail. Slowly but firmly, she spoke in a cold voice. "We received a report about a recent theft. According to the description, the suspect is a black male around 40 years old, driving a dark-colored sedan just like yours." David froze for a moment. His heart sank at the words, "just like." He realized instantly that this wasn't a routine stop. He wasn't being judged for who he was, but rather for how he looked and the color of his skin. "Officer," he began, his voice calm despite the turmoil within him, "I just returned from duty. I'm Colonel David Johnson, U.S. Navy. My identification is right here in my pocket." He nodded slightly toward his chest pocket. Officer Hayes showed no sign of acknowledgement. She didn't move, her hand still hovering near her gun, as if prepared to draw it at any moment. Her cold gaze carried an underlying sense of dread, a fear that if she let her guard down for even a second, the situation could spiral out of control. "Keep your hands on the wheel," she ordered, her tone unwavering. "I don't want any movement unless I instruct you." David bit his lip, striving to remain composed, but the tension grew, spreading like a silent wave. He understood he had no choice but to comply. Yet the situation left him feeling utterly powerless. As someone who had commanded hundreds of personnel in the military, he never imagined he would be treated like a suspect simply because of his appearance. "You can check my identification. I'm fully willing to cooperate," he repeated, maintaining a professional demeanor in his words. But Officer Hayes didn't respond. Instead, she gestured with a nod toward the outside. "Step out of the vehicle now," she said, her tone resolute, leaving no room for argument. David Johnson hesitated for a moment, He couldn't understand why he was being asked to leave his car when there was no concrete evidence against him. Hayes's icy stare froze any intent to argue. She wasn't interested in what he had to say. She only saw a suspect she needed to handle by the book. Not wanting to escalate the situation further, David slowly opened the car door and stepped out. The tension in the air between them seemed almost tangible. He could sense the curious stares of neighbors watching from a distance, peering out from behind their windows to see what was happening. But for David, the judgment in those invisible gazes felt even more oppressive than Hayes's suspicion. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes kept her distance, her eyes never leaving him for even a second. Each of her movements was marked by a cautiousness she deemed necessary. Yet deep down, memories of a past incident echoed in her mind. A suspect had once deceived her with lies, leading to harsh criticism from her superiors. She had sworn never to let that happen again. To Hayes, every explanation from David seemed like an excuse, and she wasn't willing to risk being wrong a second time. But she failed to see that her very prejudice was leading her to a far greater mistake. David stepped out of the car, his feet touching the cold ground, feeling the chill seep through the soles of his shoes as though the earth itself wanted to pull him down, trapping him in a situation he had never anticipated. Hayes's flashlight beam cut through the night like a sharp blade, piercing not just the darkness but also David's pride. His throat felt dry, and his hands trembled slightly as he struggled to suppress the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Fear, anger, and helplessness merged into a storm that threatened to overwhelm him. David instinctively moved his hand slightly as if to adjust his jacket. Hayes reacted immediately, shouting sharply, "Don't move." David's eyes widened, his hands freezing mid-motion, but Hayes had already drawn her gun, aiming it at him in a ready stance. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The hushed whispers of the neighbors fell silent, leaving only the sound of David's ragged breathing and Hayes's steely gaze dominating the scene. Officer James Miller stepped forward quickly, placing a hand on Hayes's shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "Amanda, take it easy. We need to check before doing anything rash." Hayes kept her gaze fixed on David, her hands trembling slightly but refusing to lower her weapon. In that frozen instant, David could sense fear emanating not just from himself, but also from the officer standing across from him. "Turn around. Place your hands on the hood of the car," Hayes commanded, her voice locking the final door to any shred of hope. David froze, his eyes wide, searching hers for a glimmer of understanding, a sign that this was all just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a few words. But there was nothing, only the icy, piercing stare that seemed to freeze any words of explanation. He knew that any refusal would only worsen the situation, letting out a heavy breath weighed down by resignation like a crushing stone. He turned around slowly and placed his hands on the car hood. His fingers touched the cold metal, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating tension surrounding him. Every move he made felt scrutinized, dissected down to the smallest detail. Amanda maintained a safe distance like a soldier facing a dangerous enemy. Her eyes never left him for even a second. Her tension was so palpable that the slightest movement from David seemed enough to trigger an irreversible reaction. To her, David wasn't a man nor a soldier who had just returned after 8 months of serving his country. He was merely a name on a list, a potential suspect who needed to be controlled. David felt as though time itself had slowed. Every step he took, every glance from Amanda felt like an unspoken accusation. "What did I do wrong?" he asked himself. The words from his early days in the military echoed in his mind. In any situation, staying calm is your greatest weapon. But right now, calmness wasn't enough to shatter her mistrustful gaze. It wasn't enough to dim the piercing flashlight that seemed to strip away everything he had worked so hard to build in his life. He thought of his family, the image of his 2 young children and his wife waiting at home. This should have been a moment of reunion, a time when joy triumphed over hardship. Instead, here he was, standing with his hands on the hood of his car like a criminal, while the people he had sworn to protect now saw him as a threat. The air around him felt heavy and stifling, so much so that David could hear the pounding of his heartbeat echoing in his chest. Anger began to creep through his muscles, but he knew that giving in to it would only make things worse. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the image of Amanda, the woman standing behind him with an unyielding, emotionless stare. But instead, unwelcome memories flooded back, vivid and painful, making him feel as though they were happening all over again. David thought of Derek, his black comrade with whom he had stood shoulder to shoulder on the battlefield. Derek had once told him about the times he had been mistreated and unfairly targeted by the police despite doing nothing wrong. He had recounted an incident where, upon returning from duty, even in full uniform and carrying his military ID, he was searched in front of his wife and children. Back then, David had listened with a detached sense of indignation, as though it were something from another world. But now he realized he was living in that very world. A world where skin color and prejudice could turn anyone into an enemy. David clenched his hands tighter against the car hood, struggling to maintain his composure. His eyes couldn't help but flick toward the surrounding houses. Windows were open, shadows moved behind curtains, and faint glimmers of light from phones flashed in the darkness. They were recording, capturing every moment. He wondered what the neighbors were thinking. Did they see him as a father, a soldier returning from duty? Or were they like Amanda, seeing nothing more than a suspect? Amanda remained motionless, her posture radiating vigilance. Inside her, memories of a past incident screamed, making it impossible for her to lower her guard. Back then, she had trusted a suspect, only to be deceived and let him escape. The consequences were more than just reprimands. They included the sting of betrayal and the haunting feeling of inadequacy. Now, she had vowed never to let emotions cloud her judgment. But that rigidity blinded her to the real David, a man buckling under the weight of unfair judgment. Time seemed to halt. David could hear the footsteps of neighbors drawing closer, the murmured conversations growing louder. Someone was filming. He knew that even the smallest mistake, a single wrong move, could turn this moment into a nightmare. He could already envision tomorrow's headlines: veteran detained under controversial circumstances. His image labeled as a suspect would spread far and wide, not as a hero returning home, but as a glaring example of baseless prejudice. The tension in the air was like a tightly stretched string ready to snap at any moment. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, one step away from plummeting into an abyss. He wanted to scream, to proclaim his innocence, to say he was just a man trying to return to a normal life after months of service to his country. But the words caught in his throat. He knew that at this moment, no one wanted to listen. Officer Hayes, outwardly calm, also felt the weight of the situation. She didn't dare let her guard down for even a second. Yet deeply inside, a small voice whispered, "What if I'm wrong? What if this man isn't a threat, but simply a victim of circumstance?" No one spoke. No one moved. Time seemed to freeze, trapping everyone in this unbearable tension, as if waiting for something, words, an action, or a decision to break the suffocating silence. The night air felt as though it had thickened with tension. David stood frozen, his hands pressed against the cold hood of the car, feeling the weight of countless eyes fixed on him from all directions. The siren from the second patrol car had faded into the distance, but its echo seemed to linger, a warning that refused to dissipate. The steady sound of Officer James Miller's footsteps reverberated in the quiet, each step hammering away at the patience of everyone present. David's eyes, caught in the strobe of the patrol car's lights, reflected a mix of determination and helplessness, as though he was trying to maintain control in a situation spiraling beyond his grasp. James stopped a few steps away, his gaze sweeping from Amanda to the man pinned to the car. He stood tall, his figure commanding and imposing, but in his eyes, David detected a careful restraint, not the weariness of a police officer on duty, but the hesitance of someone walking a tightrope in an extraordinarily delicate situation. "Amanda, are you sure about this?" James asked, his voice low but firm. "We're talking about a Navy colonel. If this is a mistake, the consequences will be serious." Amanda didn't flinch, her eyes sharp as steel. "I received a report about a theft. The suspect is a black male around 40 years old, driving a dark-colored sedan. He matches the description. I'm not willing to leave any possibilities unchecked. David felt a tidal wave of frustration rising within him. He had faced challenges far greater, battles at sea, split-second life and death decisions. But here on the street he called home. He had never felt so small and powerless. When facing an enemy, you know what to do. But how do you fight prejudice? He wondered. His eyes locked onto Amanda. He didn't see a police officer doing her duty. He saw an insurmountable wall of fear and suspicion. Do they see who I am? Or do they just see skin color and a description? A bitter taste rose in his throat. He had spent his life upholding justice. Yet now justice seemed nowhere to be found. James took a deep breath, as though suppressing a conflict within himself. He didn't answer immediately, instead letting his gaze shift to David, still standing restrained. Sensing the officer's attention, David spoke, his voice steady and clear, but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. Officer, I understand you're just doing your job, but if you check my identification, this will all be cleared up immediately. I'm Navy Colonel David Johnson, just returning from duty. My ID is in my left breast pocket. David's words pierced through the stifling atmosphere like a faint ray of light in an oppressive darkness. James hesitated, the uncertainty plain in his eyes. Before he could respond, Amanda stepped forward, her voice as unyielding as iron. Stay in position. We verify once the scene is secure. I won't allow any errors. David felt as though his pride had taken a direct blow. He drew a deep breath, trying to maintain composure. But anger surged through him like a river in flood. His eyes flickered to James, silently pleading for intervention. But James remained still, his face a mask of inner conflict. David knew that silence would only weaken his position further, but any action beyond compliance could escalate the situation disastrously. Each passing second added to the mounting tension as though a ticking time bomb was poised to explode. From a distance, the glow of cell phones continued to flash, and a small crowd began to form closer to the scene. The low hum of whispered conversations grew louder in the darkness. An elderly neighbor's faint voice rose from the murmurs. He's not a thief. I've seen him pass through here many times. Looks like he lives around here. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from further down the street. A middle-aged woman, her face filled with concern, rushed out from a house across the road, shouting, "Wait, I know him. He's my neighbor. He's not a thief." Amanda turned sharply, her cold gaze fixed on the woman. "Ma'am, stay back. This is a police matter." The woman stopped in her tracks, her voice trembling as she replied, "You're making a mistake. Please. He's not the person you're looking for," the woman pleaded desperately. James glanced at Amanda, his eyes betraying a flicker of hesitation. But Amanda shook her head firmly. "We can't rely on the word of a neighbor. Everything has to follow protocol." Her words fell like a drop into the tense atmosphere, creating ripples, but not enough to ease the suffocating tension. Amanda turned her steely gaze back to the woman who had spoken. "We'll handle this," she said curtly, her tone leaving no room for further intervention. This time, however, James broke his silence. Turning to Amanda, his voice carried a newfound firmness. "Don't you think it's time we check his identification? This isn't a trivial decision." Amanda paused briefly but remained resolute. "I'm not taking any chances. Once we've ensured there's no threat, I'll verify his ID. Right now, my priority is safety." David clenched his jaw, suppressing the storm of anger rising within him. As someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country, he couldn't comprehend why such a simple act as checking his identification was being delayed. His thoughts swirled, frustration at Amanda, disappointment with the system's failure, and above all, the bitter sting of feeling betrayed by the very people he had sworn to protect. James, seemingly unable to tolerate the situation any longer, stepped forward. "Amanda, I'm going to check his ID. That's the only way we end this without making it worse." Amanda shot James a sharp look, her eyes flashing with displeasure, but she said nothing. James turned to David, his tone softening. "All right, Colonel Johnson, slowly retrieve your identification. Very slowly. I don't want any risks." David nodded, his hands carefully lifting off the hood of the car. Every movement was deliberate, his caution palpable. At that moment, time seemed to freeze. All eyes were locked on him. The bright lights of recording phones glared, and the crowd collectively held its breath as if waiting for a moment that could determine everything. Cold sweat trickled down David's temple, but he knew his calmness was the only thing keeping the situation from spiraling out of control. In the suffocating stillness, even the smallest sound felt amplified, a potential trigger for chaos. But David, drawing on the composure honed from years in the military, slowly removed his wallet, holding it up for James to see. "Here," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Check it." James looked at the wallet, then back at David. He nodded, though his own hands tightened as if suppressing an inner turmoil. In that charged moment, everyone waited, not just for the truth, but to see if the unbearable tension would dissolve into relief or erupt into an uncontrollable storm. Amanda stood frozen, her gaze never leaving David for even a second. The darkness of the quiet street enveloped her, but her mind was filled with the blinding light of memories she could not erase. Those memories were like scars, painful and haunting, pushing her into a state where every decision seemed clouded by the fear of failure. In the tense moment, Amanda recalled the suspicious looks of her colleagues after her previous failure. One of them, James himself, had once said to her directly, "Hayes, you let your emotions cloud your judgment. If you don't change, you'll only be a liability to the team." Those words weren't just painful. They were like needles piercing her pride. Today, Amanda had sworn she wouldn't let anyone, not even James, doubt her abilities again. Just a few months earlier, Amanda had been involved in a pursuit of a suspect she was certain she had correctly identified. The man had seemed charming, well-dressed, and incredibly persuasive. She had been fooled by his calm demeanor and the valid documents he presented. After letting him go, she learned that he was the mastermind behind a series of organized thefts, leaving dozens of victims across the region. Her heart pounded faster as she met David's gaze, not the gaze of a criminal, but of a man weary from having to explain what should have needed no defense. Yet every time doubt flickered within her, the memory of her superior's disdainful glare after her failure resurfaced. "You lost your ability to judge. Hayes, emotions are not an excuse for failure." Those words cut deep, carving themselves into her memory. Amanda tightened her grip on her flashlight, though her hand trembled slightly, not out of fear of David, but out of fear of failing. She convinced herself that doubting David was the right thing to do, the necessary thing. Yet no matter how decisive she tried to be, something still felt wrong. That incident hadn't just left her feeling betrayed. It had shaken her standing within the team. Her colleagues began looking at her with skepticism, and her superiors didn't hesitate to criticize her. Being a cop isn't just about trust. It's about knowing when to doubt. Since then, Amanda had vowed never to make the same mistake. But that vow hadn't made her stronger. It had made her rigid and defensive whenever she faced similar situations. The haunting memory of her past failure resurfaced, making it nearly impossible for her to distinguish between justified caution and blind prejudice. When she received the report about the theft, Amanda immediately connected the dots: the suspect's description, the dark sedan, and David Johnson. To her, this was an opportunity to prove she could handle the situation, that she was no longer the naive officer who had been deceived. David, standing motionless by the car, had no idea he was being dragged into a battle not just between himself and Amanda, but between Amanda and her deep-seated fears. All he could perceive was the unreasonable suspicion in her eyes, the cold light that dismissed everything he said and every bit of honor he had earned through decades of serving his country. James, standing beside Amanda, seemed to sense that something was off. He glanced at David again, then turned to Amanda, speaking in a calm but questioning tone. "Are you sure this is the person we're looking for? He doesn't seem like someone on the run." Amanda didn't respond immediately. Her hand stayed tight on her flashlight, its beam fixed on David as though searching for something, any sign, any action to confirm she was right. "He matches the description," Amanda said firmly. though a flicker of unease crept into her voice. David seized the moment to try once more. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but if you check my ID, everything will be clear. I have nothing to hide." Amanda's gaze wavered for a moment, but then the memory of criticism, of judgmental stares from her colleagues, surged back. She didn't want to be fooled again, didn't want to appear weak in anyone's eyes. "We'll check later," Amanda said, her voice carrying the weight of a verdict. "First, I need to ensure the situation is safe." David bit his lip, holding back the anger that burned inside him. He knew that every word he spoke now would feel like shouting into the void. To Amanda, he wasn't a soldier defending his honor. He was just a description on a report, a suspect to be thoroughly examined. James, though silent, could feel the tension in the air. He stepped back, putting some distance between himself and the confrontation, leaving Amanda to face David directly. Amanda didn't realize that in her effort to prove herself, she was driving this situation toward a dangerous stalemate, one where both sides could end up paying a heavy price. Amanda stood motionless, her piercing gaze locked onto David as if he were the final piece of a puzzle that would close the case. The quiet street, previously enveloped in stillness, was now filled with whispers and murmurs as the flashing lights of the patrol car drew the curious eyes of neighbors. Windows creaked open, curtains fluttered slightly, and the small neighborhood watched the tense scene unfold. On the second floor of a house across the street, a middle-aged woman held her phone, its camera fixed on David. She whispered to her husband, "This doesn't seem right. Look at him. He doesn't look like a criminal." But no one other than her husband heard her words. Meanwhile, on her phone screen, the caption read, "Black man detained by police right outside his own home." With just a few taps, the video was uploaded, and the power of social media began to ripple outward. Comments poured in, ranging from harsh criticism of Amanda to staunch defenses claiming the police were just doing their job. At the scene, David felt the weight of pressure bearing down on him, not just Amanda's scrutinizing gaze or the weapon at her hip, but the collective eyes of an entire community. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes and gathering along the sidewalk. Every glance, every whisper felt like kindling, feeding the fire of injustice burning inside him. Then a voice called out from the crowd, "David, is that you?" David turned his head and saw John Roberts, a former Navy comrade, rushing toward him, his face a mix of shock and anger. John had been driving past when he saw the scene. Without hesitation, he stopped his car, striding quickly toward Amanda and David with a commanding voice. "What is going on here?" Amanda glanced at John, momentarily taken aback by his sudden appearance, but her expression remained firm. Before she could respond, John positioned himself in front of David, a protective wall between his comrade and the officers. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" John's voice rang out clear and resolute. "This is Colonel David Johnson, an exemplary Navy officer who has just returned from serving his country. Why are you treating him like a criminal?" John's words struck like thunder in the heavy atmosphere. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some nodded in agreement, while others stepped back, visibly unsettled by what they were witnessing. Amanda, sensing the tension in the air, tried to maintain her authority. She emphasized, her tone cold but lacking its previous steadiness. "This individual matches the description from a recent theft report. We're just doing our job. If he has nothing to hide, cooperation will make this easier." John let out a bitter laugh, his expression a mix of outrage and disbelief. His eyes burned with barely contained anger as he retorted, "Cooperation? He's been cooperating from the start. What you're doing isn't your job. It's blatant humiliation and abuse of power." John's words escalated the tension even further. The once passive onlookers were no longer silent. Some began shouting questions at Amanda, challenging her actions. The accusing eyes were no longer directed at David. They were now focused on her. James, Amanda's partner, could see that the situation was spiraling out of control. He recognized that Amanda was being cornered, but he also knew that without intervention, this incident could erupt into a full-blown media crisis. David stood still at the center of the chaos, feeling the depth of his helplessness. He didn't want to exacerbate the situation, but the anger and pain of being treated so unjustly churned within him. At that moment, David thought to himself, will justice prevail? Or will this become just another story of prejudice and injustice that people quickly forget? The tension at the scene was like a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. The crowd murmured louder, seeing David standing straight yet treated as though he were a criminal. John Roberts remained firmly between David and Amanda, his gaze blazing with anger directed at her. Before anyone could say more, the sound of a third patrol car broke through the heavy atmosphere. From the newly arrived vehicle emerged a woman whose immaculate uniform and commanding presence drew immediate attention. Sergeant Elizabeth Turner, a highly respected senior officer, had a reputation for fairness and integrity. To many, she was the embodiment of justice. Elizabeth approached the scene, her sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. She immediately noticed the tension etched on David's face and the stiffness in Amanda's posture. But what struck her most was David himself, a familiar face. It took only a moment for Elizabeth to recognize him. David Johnson, a Navy colonel she had worked alongside on a significant mission years ago. David. Elizabeth called his name, her voice tinged with surprise and warmth. David turned, his eyes briefly lighting with a glimmer of hope. He nodded, saying nothing, but his gaze conveyed all the explanation and longing for a resolution he couldn't express aloud. Elizabeth quickly stepped toward Amanda and James. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Amanda, though trying to maintain her professional demeanor, couldn't hide her unease under Elizabeth's authoritative scrutiny. "What's going on here?" Elizabeth asked, her tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Amanda responded promptly, "We're investigating a theft report. This individual matches the description of the suspect, a black male around 40 years old, driving a dark-colored sedan." Elizabeth turned her attention to David, her gaze softening as she noted the exhaustion and hurt behind his composed exterior. After a brief pause, she asked, "Have you presented your identification yet?" David shook his head, his voice impressively steady despite the circumstances. "I've offered multiple times, but they refused to check." Elizabeth's expression hardened as she turned back to Amanda, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you check his identification before making any assumptions? That's the most basic protocol an officer must follow." Amanda faltered, her lips pressing into a tight line as she struggled for an explanation. "We were prioritizing safety. He matched the description, and we couldn't just take his word for it." Elizabeth cut her off, her tone firm. "A match to a description is not evidence. This man has the right to prove his innocence. Had you verified his ID from the beginning, this situation would never have escalated to this point." Elizabeth turned back to David and spoke gently. "Colonel Johnson, may I see your identification?" David nodded, moving slowly and deliberately as he retrieved his wallet. The tension in the air seemed to ease slightly as Elizabeth took his military ID, examined it carefully, and then nodded in confirmation. "This is Colonel David Johnson, a Navy officer who has dedicated years of service to our country," Elizabeth declared, her voice clear and deliberate, ensuring everyone could hear. The crowd fell silent. Amanda froze, her face a mask of shock and confusion. Shame and regret began to seep into her expression, but she could find no words to defend herself. James, too, remained quiet, his gaze shifting toward David in what seemed like an unspoken acknowledgement of his error. Elizabeth's sharp gaze shifted back to Amanda, her disappointment evident. "As officers, we are entrusted to uphold justice, not enforce prejudice. Your mistake today has not only wronged an innocent man but has also damaged the community's trust in us." Amanda said nothing, but the cracks in her facade revealed the turmoil within. She realized her past fears had clouded her judgment, and the cost had been the honor of a man who had devoted his life to serving his country. After returning David's ID, Elizabeth gently placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm sorry for what happened here. I will ensure this is handled appropriately." Elizabeth's words felt like a lifeline, but David knew the scars of this experience would linger. He simply nodded, remaining silent as the heavy atmosphere settled more deeply over the scene, leaving everyone with an uncomfortable sense of what had just transpired. The silence blanketed the scene like a heavy shroud, so tense it seemed a single breath might tear it apart. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cars reflected off the damp pavement, casting distorted shadows on the walls of the nearby houses. David stood tall, clutching the documents Elizabeth had returned to him, but his eyes remained fixed on Amanda. Inside him raged a storm of emotions: anger, disappointment, and the deep ache of having his honor trampled by those he once trusted to uphold justice. Amanda stood motionless, her gaze lowered, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Elizabeth's silence was not one of patience, but of judgment more damning than any spoken words. When Elizabeth finally broke the silence, her voice was calm but razor-sharp, each word cutting deeper into Amanda's growing shame. "Officer Hayes," Elizabeth said, her piercing eyes drilling into Amanda, "can you explain why, when this man repeatedly offered to show his ID, you refused to perform the most basic protocol? What stopped you from doing so immediately?" Amanda felt as though the ground beneath her feet was giving way. Elizabeth's words were a public indictment, leaving her no room for defense. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the crowd, faces half hidden in the shadows, every one of them watching with judgment in their eyes. I just wanted to ensure safety," Amanda stammered, her voice faltering as if grasping for an excuse she knew wouldn't hold. He matched the description. "I thought it was necessary to proceed with caution before concluding." Elizabeth frowned, her disappointment evident. Ensuring safety doesn't mean abandoning fairness. You let your fear and personal bias dictate your actions. The process of verifying identification exists precisely to prevent situations like this, but you chose to ignore it. That is not how a police officer should operate. James Miller, standing beside Amanda, bowed his head in silence. He knew Elizabeth was right. As her partner, he should have intervened earlier, but his indecision had only compounded the situation. He glanced at David, a man who had just endured profound injustice, before turning his gaze back to Amanda, silently urging her to confront her mistakes honestly. Amanda felt paralyzed. Every word from Elizabeth didn't just humiliate her, but also unearthed painful memories of past failures. Yet this time there was no room for excuses. The crowd's eyes, Elizabeth's gaze, and James's silent disapproval all bore down on her, demanding a response she struggled to find. "I was wrong," Amanda finally said, her voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. "I admit that the pressure of the job and my past experiences clouded my judgment. I didn't intend to harm anyone, but that doesn't excuse my actions today," Amanda admitted, her voice trembling. At that moment, she recalled a conversation with a senior colleague who had once tried to counsel her. "Hayes, being tough is good, but being too rigid will make you lose your ability to understand. A police officer needs not just decisiveness, but also compassion to make the right judgment." At the time, Amanda hadn't thought much of those words. Now they echoed in her mind like a belated warning. She looked up at David, her gaze no longer hardened but weary and tinged with regret. "This isn't the way," Amanda thought. "I let my fear of failure hurt an innocent man." Elizabeth nodded slightly, though her eyes remained stern. "Mistakes are something we all make, Amanda, but when we wear this uniform, every mistake carries consequences not just for us, but for the people we are sworn to protect. Your actions today didn't just harm David Johnson's honor, they damaged the community's trust in us as officers." Elizabeth's words felt like a hammer blow to Amanda. She nodded, her throat tight. She turned to David, her lips moving as if to say something, but no words came out. David stood silently, his gaze neither filled with anger nor forgiveness, but with the weariness of a man who had endured too much. For a moment, Amanda realized no apology could repair the damage she had caused. The crowd remained, though some people began retreating to their homes. Others stayed, watching intently as though waiting for closure. A few phones continued recording, not just to capture Amanda's humiliation, but as evidence of a system that needed reform. Elizabeth turned to David, her expression softening slightly. Tilting her head, she spoke gently but firmly. "Colonel Johnson, on behalf of the police force, I apologize for what has happened. This should never have occurred, and I will ensure it never happens again." David nodded but said nothing. His eyes flickered as if he wanted to respond, but instead he turned away and placed his documents back into his pocket. His silence spoke louder than any words, a powerful reminder that the wounds inflicted on him would not be easily healed. Amanda felt not just Elizabeth's disappointment, but also the estrangement of her colleagues. James Miller, who had been her steadfast partner on numerous assignments, now avoided her gaze as though he no longer recognized the officer he once trusted. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their tone no longer holding any respect or trust for Amanda. How can she be allowed to stay on duty with an attitude like that? A man muttered loudly enough for Amanda to hear. Another woman shook her head, her expression filled with disdain. She didn't just harm David. She tarnished the image of the entire police force. Amanda felt frozen in place, every stare a silent accusation. She thought of all the hours she had poured into building trust with the community, the relentless work she had done to prove herself a fair officer. And now, one mistake had undone it all. As the crowd began to disperse, Amanda remained, facing the heavy silence of her colleagues. James finally spoke, his voice devoid of the empathy it once carried. "Amanda, I can't defend you this time. What you did didn't just hurt an innocent man. It cost the entire team the community's trust. You have to face the consequences." Elizabeth stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Amanda's shoulder. Her tone was stern but meaningful. "This mistake isn't just personal. It's a stain on the entire team. You need to understand that your lapse in judgment harmed not only David Johnson's honor, but also the integrity of the police force we represent." Amanda lowered her head, the weight of her past efforts to build a reputation now shattered. She realized she hadn't just lost the community's trust, but also that of her colleagues who had once stood by her side. Amanda stood motionless, her fists clenched at her sides, her gaze heavy and fixed on the ground. She took a deep breath. Summoning what little courage she had left, she stepped forward toward David, her voice shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Colonel Johnson, I want to offer you my sincere apology. What I did today wasn't just a mistake. It was an injustice you didn't deserve. I failed to perform my duty properly, and I deeply regret the harm I've caused you." David lifted his head, his eyes briefly showing a flicker of surprise, though they remained clouded with weariness and deep disappointment. He didn't respond immediately, standing in silence as if weighing her words. Amanda continued, her voice slowing as she tried to ensure every word carried meaning. "No apology can undo what happened. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I commit to learning from this mistake and becoming a better officer and a better person. I hope that someday I can make amends by serving the community the way I should have from the start." David met her gaze directly. His eyes no longer held anger, but neither did they hold forgiveness. After a long pause, he gave a small nod, signaling closure rather than acceptance. Amanda's heartfelt apology, while genuine, could not erase the scars this experience had left on him. Elizabeth, having observed the exchange, broke the silence. "Officer Hayes, your apology is the first step, but as I've said, mistakes come with consequences. I will recommend an internal investigation into your conduct in this incident, and I expect you to be ready to face whatever decisions the department makes." Amanda nodded, offering no resistance. She understood that what lay ahead was disciplinary action, a significant setback in her career, but also an opportunity to learn and change. As the scene dispersed, Amanda stood alone, her uniform feeling heavier than ever. She had taken her first step toward accountability, but the road to redemption would be long. David, meanwhile, walked away with the quiet dignity of a man whose honor had been restored but whose trust in the system had been irreparably shaken. For the community, the incident would linger as a reminder of the urgent need for reform and accountability. For Amanda, it would remain an indelible mark, a lesson paid for with the trust and reputation she had worked so hard to build. As Amanda bowed her head in apology, David felt an overwhelming silence descend around him. Her words echoed in the air, but they weren't loud enough to erase the injustice he had endured. He wanted to say he forgave her, wanted to believe her apology was genuine. Yet deep inside a voice whispered, "Is forgiveness this simple? Will this apology change anything?" David looked at Amanda but couldn't bring himself to respond, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. He felt as though he were standing in a void where anger, disappointment, and compassion warred within him, none gaining the upper hand. He turned and walked toward his car, each step heavier than the last. Should I feel relieved that this is over, or mourn the fact that it happened at all? He wondered. David knew the memory of this experience would linger, but he reminded himself that he had to remain strong, not just for himself but for others who might face the same injustice. Driving home in silence, the events of the day replayed in his mind like an unending loop. When he finally pulled up to his familiar home, the glow from the living room window shone like a small beacon in the night. He stepped out of the car, his shoulders burdened by the weight of the day. The front door opened, and there stood his wife, Sarah. She froze for a moment, her eyes scanning the exhaustion etched into his face. No words were needed. Sarah stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around him. "You're home," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing, a balm to his weary soul. Their 2 children came running, clinging to his legs with pure joy lighting up their eyes at their father's return. David knelt, enveloping them in his arms, feeling their warmth seep into his being, momentarily washing away the heaviness of the day. At that moment, David felt a flicker of light pierce through the darkness of his emotions. The presence of his family reminded him that no matter how unjust the world might be, love remained steadfast and unshakable. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking perhaps this is the only way to begin healing, through the simplest of things. In the days following the incident, the video of David being detained by police on the street quickly went viral on social media. It garnered hundreds of thousands of views, accompanied by countless comments debating injustice, prejudice, and police conduct. David's story became a focal point not only online but also in local news and television broadcasts. David never intended to become a symbol, but his story sparked a wave of outrage and empathy within the community. Many shared similar experiences, and discussions about prejudice and justice began to emerge everywhere. Local authorities were compelled to hold public meetings to hear citizens' voices, and a campaign to raise awareness about racial bias was launched. David, after spending a few quiet days with his family, decided to speak out. He wrote a post on social media not to criticize but to call for change. "I'm not writing this to criticize or create division. I'm writing because I believe that no matter where we come from or the color of our skin, we all deserve to be treated fairly and with respect. What I went through is a reminder that there is still much work to be done to build a fair society. I hope my story will not just be a fleeting headline but a stepping stone for real change. Let's not allow prejudice to cloud our ability to see people for who they truly are." David's post was widely shared, garnering attention from human rights organizations and even government officials. Many were moved by the sincerity of his message and joined discussions aimed at fostering change in how communities and law enforcement treat individuals. A week later, at a community event held to discuss justice and accountability, Amanda Hayes also made an appearance. She stepped onto the stage, her eyes scanning the crowd before her. Some faces were welcoming, but others still held anger and suspicion. Amanda understood that today's apology was just the first step in a long journey to make amends. Taking a deep breath, her voice shaky yet earnest, she began, "I have lost the trust not only of Colonel Johnson but also of this community and my colleagues. I have learned that being a police officer is not just about ensuring safety but about upholding fairness and compassion. My mistake was failing to realize that when it mattered most." From the audience, a former colleague looked at Amanda with disappointment, silently shaking his head. Amanda realized that to regain the trust of people like him, she needed to prove herself through actions, not just words. Following the event, Amanda received notice that she would be suspended for an extended period and required to undergo retraining. In the days that followed, she endured cold stares from coworkers, whispers in hallways, and even sharp remarks like, Can she change, or will she remain a disappointment to the team? Amanda knew repairing such a significant mistake wouldn't be easy. Yet instead of succumbing to despair, she resolved to see this as an opportunity for growth. She began attending community events, not to justify her actions, but to listen and learn. She spoke to school children about the importance of compassion and fairness, hoping to impart values she had failed to uphold. Amanda understood that no matter what she did, the stain of her mistake would always be part of her past. Yet she also recognized that it is through mistakes that people can learn to be better. At the end of one event, the audience was silent for a moment before breaking into applause. Some looked at Amanda with newfound understanding, while others remained cautious. But regardless of their feelings, Amanda's acknowledgement of her error and commitment to change laid the foundation for healing. David, who had quietly observed the event, approached Amanda as she stepped off the stage. Without a word, he extended his hand. Amanda hesitated, then took it. The handshake, though simple, conveyed a powerful message: change begins with us. The community event marked a fresh start not only for Amanda but for the community as a whole. Training on unconscious bias was incorporated into the local police department's curriculum. Stories like David's became examples in discussions, helping people better understand the importance of respect and fairness. As for David, he returned to his family and his daily life, now a symbol of resilience and faith in justice. The emotional wounds he endured would take time to heal, but he knew his story had helped shift perceptions. In his journal, David wrote, "We can't change the world overnight, but we can start by changing our thoughts. I hope that one day, stories like mine will no longer need to be told." David's story concludes not just with an apology, but with a shared commitment to create a society where everyone is treated with fairness, dignity, and compassion. His journey is a powerful testament to how deeply prejudice can wound, but also how hope and action can inspire meaningful change. What would you do if you were in David's situation? Do you believe an apology and a commitment to change are enough? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you found this story meaningful and worth sharing, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread its message. Your support fuels our mission to bring impactful stories to the community. Thank you for taking the time to listen and stand with us. See you in our next video.